real parents, real stories. It's the Meet the Parents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 48 of the Meet the Parents podcast and your weekly dose of parenting chat. I'm Tim from Slouching Towards Thatcham, and this evening I'm joined by John from Dad You Geek and Simon from Man vs Pink. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
So on this week's podcast, in the aftermath of the Westminster terrorist attack, we're going to talk about how we tell our kids about bad news and also chat a little bit about our respective Mother's Days. Enough has already been written and said about the terrorist attack in Westminster last week, some of it quite erudite and some of it spouted by Katie Hopkins. But what I want to talk about instead is how we expose our kids both to bad news and to other content which may not necessarily be suitable for younger eyes and ears. Let's start with the news. Every day our TVs, computer screens and newspapers are full of troubling images and stories, from the recent story about the Chicago teenager whose sexual assault was broadcast on Facebook Live to the suffering of those in Syria and many other countries. There's enough graphic violence on our screens to make Game of Thrones look like a particularly mild episode of Waverloo. So, John, of the three of us, you have the two oldest kids. So can you remember, was there a particular age before which you were selective about what news the girls were exposed to?
Yes and no. What we kind of did with both of them was to try to manage their curiosity, really. And in that respect, they were both very different. Ashley, who's the older one, she's never really been that interested. As a youngster, she certainly wasn't that interested in watching the news, whereas Katie is very interested in current affairs and what's going on in the world and its impact. And she's quite sensitive to that, really, and wants to know what's going on. So I think certainly with Katie, I think we really started to discuss about current affairs with her when she was about 9 or 10, because she had proved to have quite a sensible head, even though a very sensitive head on those shoulders. But that was the age with her. Whereas with Ashley, I think she may have been a little bit older, really, when we really had the full-on discussion.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, news these days is everywhere in a way that it wasn't necessarily, I guess, when Ashley was younger.
No, and I think it's certainly more of, I think if I had youngsters now watching the most recent terrorist attack unfold, I don't, if the children were at home, I wouldn't have had it on, because certainly some of the scenes on some of the news channels that I was watching was graphic, and I can't believe that they're not going to get complaints about that.
There's plenty of that now, isn't there? There's such as the proliferation of smartphones and social media that a lot of stuff gets put on our screens that's either unfiltered or that gets put on by news stations in the rush to be first and to have the exclusive news. Now, I had to check this because it's scary how quickly time flies, but it's 15 going on 16 years now since 9/11, which is a key reference point for many people. Ashley would have been, I guess, 5 or so at that point, and obviously the events of that particular day, far too much for a young mind to absorb at that time. But thinking about it, I mean, was she aware at all of what had happened and the enormity of it? And, I guess it's probably not something that you would have actively spoken to her about.
Yes and no. Unfortunately, being working parent, we were both working parents, and her nan picked her up on the day of 9/11 from school. And Ashley knew something was wrong because her nan was walking at a lot faster pace than they usually walked home from school. And if you speak to Ashley now, she's still got a vivid memory of being rushed out of school, rushed home, and kind of given free rein to play with whatever she wanted, really, because Nan wanted to watch what was unfolding on the telly. We kind of really didn't have much of a conversation with her. Yeah, I'd say she was aware, but didn't really understand the consequences of that. I remember we carried on checking with her to see what her understanding was, because obviously in school everyone was talking about it. So it was difficult and quite a hard thing to manage, and we kind of let her ask the questions and was led by her again. I said it earlier, managing their curiosity. If a child's asking questions, they're obviously curious. They've obviously digested something, and it's our role as parents to try and explain that to them in as simple terms as possible without scaring the living daylights out of them.
Yeah, and as you say, you can't necessarily control what kids get to hear and don't get to hear, isn't it? Because older kids are talking about it in the playground. You hear parents talking about it. It's very difficult to insulate them, isn't it?
It is. It's quite a difficult one as well, because I know certainly with certain terror attacks and some of those in France, a lot of schools had a minute silence during assemblies. I know of one or two schools that actually used some of the broadcasts that Newsround featured and showed that to the children just before the minute silence, so they had some form of understanding, but it was in a structured way that was in a way that was presented for children. And that's where I think Newsround's a brilliant source of news for children.
We'll come back to news media that's tailored specifically for children in a little while. So, I mean, Simon, your daughter's 5 now. Did you talk to her at all about what happened last week?
No, not at all. I guess it didn't occur to me. I think at her age, it's not necessarily the graphic nature or the violent nature. I don't mean about the images necessarily, but about what happened. It's more the lack of understanding of the context of all of these events. We can't even make sense of these things, but for a child without having any sense of history or much sense of history about it, even more so. So I think that was one of the things to me. It would just seem like a random, horrible thing, but it's also part of a bigger picture, which she's not aware of yet. It's interesting. Another thing last week was this was like the first time we'd kind of done anything around Red Nose Day, and they were doing stuff at school about it. So we let her stay up to watch some of it up until 9 o'clock, actually. And I don't know if you guys saw it, but there were some pretty harrowing films on there. There was dead babies, and I think 2 films there were dead babies or dead children, certainly.
They showed the one dying and then covering her in a blanket. So I remember that one, and that was quite early on.
It was, so we were talking to her. I didn't, in terms of her seeing that, I didn't mind that, and she was very concerned. She's very empathetic, and she was very interested and concerned about it. And I don't know, she was like, she knew what she was watching, but she asked, like, what's happened to that baby? And we said, well, it's died. That's what they're talking about. And that is a different thing, because although there's still a context to it, the basic fact of it is that these children were dying from lack of nutrition and lack of medical care, or just not getting the right things in time. And that's really what these fundraisers are about. It's just about getting those logistics going. So I thought it was kind of valid for her to understand those things.
And it's quite a difficult topic, isn't it? I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about how just the whole subject of the death of family and friends that's quite an abstract concept for such a young mind to deal with. And then when you're trying to talk to them about death and suffering, in the context of things that are in our kind of first world context eminently avoidable, death through famine, death through through illnesses that are either very rare or have been eradicated in first world countries. And that's really difficult to try to explain, but it's valuable to try and help them understand the nature of the world we live in. Simon, we've talked before about the fact that you're a big film buff, and you've always been comfortable with letting your daughter watch films that have, in their own way, some fairly grown-up themes, and you talk to her in quite a grown-up way about them. Now, do you think at all that you take a different approach when it comes to introducing her to things that are factual versus things that she's seeing on a screen that are fictional? Do you handle it differently, and should we handle it differently?
To me, it's all part of the same thing. With these, superhero movies or Star Wars movies, you can introduce these ideas, but in a fantastical setting. But the ideas are still there of, let's talk about, violence or corruption or, even moral ambiguity. Like, I've had a very clear idea of there was good people and bad people growing up and heroes and villains. And it's quite interesting. A lot of the films now have a kind of nuance about it. Nuance is probably a bit strong, but there's a range to of motivations going on sometimes. And I don't know, like the last Star Wars film, Rogue One, like, so the rebels good, Empire bad. You had people working in the Empire who were trying to do good things for the greater cause. You had people in the rebellion that were happy to kill innocent people if it meant going for the greater cause. And I think those kind of things can help with making sense of the world, as she progresses, just introducing new ideas of things. The governments can be fallible. You can't necessarily always trust the police. You kind of have to take everything on its own terms. I think I'm pretty adept at discerning the different tones. I don't know, like the Batman movies, they're too realistic in their tone and their violence, but the Avengers movies mostly are not. The tone of the violence is fantastical, and she's never had any sort of nightmares or traumas about it. Unlike, say, Toy Story 3, which still kind of, I don't know if you've seen the end where they're all kind of going to their death in the smelter. I've never seen her as upset about anything as that.
Yeah, our kids still get upset by that as well. I mean, this whole subject of ambiguity is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because I guess, John, with Katie, she's at that age now where I guess it's a little bit easier to talk to her about, all the shades of grey and the fact that good people aren't always the ones wearing the white hats and so on. Do you find yourself having that kind of conversation with her?
You do, and it kind of scares me really how wise ahead she's got, how wise she is really, and she understands. Recently, it was actually only today, we were talking about the news in Russia and Belarus, and she was questioning why it was happening, and surely the government should be stepping in. And that was when we was discussing how it's not always that straightforward and that easy to do that. News leads to more question these days than answers, if that makes sense. Encouraging to see actually that she's got a moral compass that's swinging the right way. So you've done something right as a parent there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think when kids get to the kind of age that Katie's at, that they start to discover that not every question has an easy answer, or indeed, there isn't always one right answer to things, and it encourages them to start making their own choices, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword, I guess. You're hoping that they'll make good decisions, but at the same time, they realise that there isn't necessarily, one answer to all problems, and that different people will respond to things in different ways, and it's all about choosing your own path and making your own decisions.
That's it, and it's all about negotiating as well, because one thing Katie has learned, certainly since she's been at senior school, is that decisions that you make have consequences. And whereas you might see it as the correct decision, somebody or one of your close friends might disagree with you and have a completely different viewpoint. And it's not to say that yours is right and theirs is wrong. It's just some people will just take a different view and stance on a situation.
And going back to films for a second, I mean, one thing we found watching films with our kids is that the kind of progression they go through isn't necessarily linear. So, for instance, kids don't really get Fear and Jeopardy until a certain age. So with Isaac, he was about probably 5.5, I think. I remember taking him and Toby to watch the second Planes film, which revolves around basically a big forest fire, and he'd watched stuff that I would consider scarier than that before, and yet he was terrified by it, and he really struggled to separate fact from fiction, even though the characters in the film are talking aircraft and cars, which bit of a giveaway. And John, going back to all the unpleasantness in the real world, can you remember the first time you talked to either Ashley or Katie about some of the kind of real world topics such as murder and terrorism and stuff like that? I mean, how old would they have been at the time? And
unfortunately, I do, yeah. So for I don't really remember for Ashley, and that's really bad. I can't remember when we discussed with her being 20 odd now. It would have been too long ago for me to remember, I think. But with Katie, we unfortunately I was involved in an event that meant eventually we'd have to explain to her what happened, etc. So the road behind where we used to live, I heard some screaming for some help, and I had to run and stumbled into a murder scene, which wasn't very pleasant. Katie was aware that Daddy had to go to the police station, but didn't know why. And there was all these men. Unfortunately, the way you come from our house to go to school was past the end of that road, and she'd seen the men in the white suits and everything, and didn't really understand what was going on. And it was only when the local news had come out and people were asking Katie, isn't that near where you live? That we sat down and explained to her exactly what happened and what it meant and why it wasn't a regular occurrence where we live. And that was when she was at 9 years old.
That's tough, isn't it? Because it's so far removed from the normal experience that most kids grow up with, and it's and it is one of those real kind of taking away the innocence moments, isn't it?
It was. We didn't tell her for as long as we could, really.
Simon, any thoughts on how you might go about approaching, having this kind of discussion with your daughter one day?
I think it depends on the event and what the circumstances around it are. I mean, there's, in terms of the idea of, crime and murder. I mean, that's kind of partly what would go back to what we were talking about before, like showing I don't know what we're watching The Flash at the moment. It's all based around a crime. He's a forensic scientist from his day job, so there's always kind of murder scenes he's going around, and I don't know. I don't see it as a loss of innocence. It's more I'm introducing these elements in a safe, fantastical way, within a story about a superhero that can, is the fastest man alive. It's just part of another story, and everything they learn really at this age is through stories. Anyway, I think so. Moral things, human things, and it's just another way of doing that.
So I was going to say, it's exactly what history has done. So nursery rhymes, a lot of them were teaching children about the dangers of what they can expect. And Simon's just finding a more interesting way of doing that, I guess.
Fairy tales as well. They're really, I think that's what I took my cue from. Like, centuries of children reading these gruesome fairy tales.
Which is exactly what I meant when I said nursery rhymes. I actually meant fairy tales.
We know what you meant.
I'm glad somebody does.
Yeah, and Simon, I mean, you'll know from watching The Flash that even though it's quite light and comic book in its kind of look and feel, that there are still some quite dark themes there to handle, like how Barry deals with the death of his mother and so on, and the temptation to go back and change it.
That's true, but what's interesting? What's interesting about that show is it's all Barry, the character, is optimistic, even though the central thing in his life is his mother being killed by this mysterious being and his father in jail for it. He's still a hopeful character, an optimistic character. And that's, I think, the linchpin that children can latch onto. Like, this man is an optimistic, hopeful person, and he's so optimistic about the world. He wants to become a hero and help other people.
Before Simon and I geek out too much, we probably ought to move on.
Sorry.
We've touched on this already. I mean, I do think it's much more difficult for parents these days than it was when we were children. I mean, for one thing, we're now used to there being so much more sex, violence and bad behaviour on our screens these days. As we've said, it's pretty much impossible to completely insulate kids from the real world now, what with 24-hour TV news cycles, the internet and the inevitable chatter about stuff in school playgrounds. Kids will hear about tragedy one way or another, and there comes a point where we do actually actively want them to take an interest, as John was saying with Katie earlier. We want them to be interested in what's happening in the real world, even if it does mean that they have to shed some of their innocence.
But I think, sorry to go into that, that's kind of something I don't look at it that way, as them losing their innocence. I'm trying to keep it in a way that she's still, I don't know if it's possible, but she's still innocent, but these things don't suddenly, become revealed to her later. Like these are little kind of germs of ideas or concepts that are always going to be in there. And then, when she becomes even more aware of the world, that then she can kind of put into play all these moral quandaries she's already worked out in her head or already seen, like played out in another medium.
That's a really good way of putting it, because I think it's a much easier conversation if it's a gradual one, rather than it suddenly being a shock where you suddenly realise one day that the world isn't as bright and friendly a place as it is. So to introduce those concepts to them gradually and get them used to it and get them talking about it and realising how the world is I guess that has to be infinitely more preferable to giving them the short, sharp shock.
I guess my perspective, I always think as long as she feels secure and loved and happy, then we can talk about it from that perspective, that she's got this, she's grounded, she's centered, she's okay, but we can talk about how things occur elsewhere, but she doesn't have to feel too overwhelmed by it or scared by it, because she's got this secure environment.
Yeah, and that safe environment that you get with family is definitely really important in terms of helping them understand and to feel secure in a world that doesn't always necessarily feel that safe. I was just going to finish off by saying, I saw a 7-step guide about how to talk to kids about scary news that was tweeted by Nikki Cox, who's the editor of First News, which is a weekly newspaper aimed specifically at 7 to 14-year-olds. So I will put a link to it in the show notes, but here's a quick summary of what it said. Firstly, don't turn the news off, as we can't completely control how kids access information in our modern world. It's better to arm kids with the real facts rather than hearing exaggerated second or third hand versions or very skewed interpretations. Even if your child doesn't talk about bad news, it's really important not to assume that they don't know it or they're not troubled by it. It helps to explain in simple terms what has happened and not to sensationalise it in the way certain sections of the media might do. It talks about putting bad news into context and balance. It's worth reminding them that there is a lot of good news as well as bad news in the world, and that there are many more good people than bad. I guess finally, the very last point is, that when things like this happen, as parents, we should just hold them a little bit closer and for a bit longer. A little reassurance from the people they look to for protection in their young lives, and who provide that safe environment for them goes a long way. Now, I do think the point about looking at the big picture and offering some perspective is particularly key. It is important to remember that events such as last week's reveal the best as well as the worst in humanity. And I think we did see coming out on social media that there were a lot of heroes as well as the one villain in this story. There was the MP, Tobias Elwood, who didn't hesitate to give CPR to try to save the police officer who sadly did die from his stab wounds. There were the doctors and nurses from nearby St Thomas's Hospital who ran to the scene without hesitation, not knowing whether the danger had yet passed. I mean, that ambulance drivers, police first responders, there were so many heroic small deeds that don't necessarily get the coverage they deserve. You look at it and those deeds and actions far outweigh those of the idiots, such as, did you see the guy with the selfie stick?
I did.
No.
Yes. The end of Westminster Bridge, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was busy taking a photo of himself with a selfie stick in front of one of the ambulances, just for posterity. So on that note, I think I'm going to turn off the news and watch something far less traumatic, like 24 Legacy. Let's talk now about Mother's Day. So last Sunday was petrol station's favourite day of the year, one of 2 days in the year alongside Valentine's Day when they do a roaring morning trade in flowers and chocolates. So what did we all get up to on Mother's Day? John?
So Mother's Day for me was actually a pretty relaxed affair. Ashley was away, so it's her boyfriend's birthday last week, so they'd already booked a weekend away. So she was back on Sunday afternoon, so Sunday morning, myself and Katie cooked Mel breakfast, which was quite nice. And in the afternoon, they all went off for a girls' evening out at the cinema with Mel's mum as well to go and see Beauty and the Beast. Whilst I went over to see my mum give her flowers, which she very much appreciated. She, as in true style, every Sunday night went off to bingo, and me and my dad went to the cinema, which was brilliant. So it was a pretty relaxed day. Perfect Sunday, really.
Excellent. How about you, Simon? I know you weren't all necessarily that well in your household over the weekend.
Yeah, no, we had nothing really planned with Mother's Day and Father's Day, and we just kind of make it up to the individual being celebrated, like to what they want to do that day. And Liv was just saying she'll see what it's like on the day, really. Like if it's a nice day, we'll go for a nice country walk or something. But yeah, unfortunately, we're all kind of fighting coughs and colds and things, and we had a pretty bad run this week, especially my wife. So dealing with our sick daughter and then herself. So she was just she had a terrible night on Saturday. So the last thing she wanted to do was go out for a big country walk. So we just kind of went out for a stroll and got some stuff to make bagels at home. And then the thing she said she wanted to do was do some clearing up in the garden. So she did.
Mother's Day this year for us was a bit of a bittersweet affair. I mean, on the one hand, we did a lot of the things that have become part of the annual routine in our household. So the kids made up their own cards, and they were all very keen about bringing mummy up breakfast in bed. We cooked all the meals during the day. Now, if only we could get the kids to be half as nice for the other 364 days of the year. But we went out for a meal with my folks on the Saturday night. and then we ended up having a relatively kind of quiet family day at home on the Sunday. So I said it was bittersweet because at the same time as us celebrating Mother's Day, we were dealing with the fact that there's one mother fewer in our family this year. I think I mentioned a few episodes ago that my mother-in-law passed away a couple of months ago, and that was something that had double the impact because it would also have been her birthday in the week beforehand.
Oh God.
You cope with it, and every family has to go through that kind of experience at some stage. So there's nothing that sets us apart from thousands and thousands of other families around the world. But I think it's experiencing it for the first time. I think it hit quite hard, in that combination of Mother's Day and the birthday being very close together. Yeah, and it really kind of brought it home for me as well, because my mum turns 80 this year, and the reality is that I'm not going to have too many more Mother's Days to celebrate with her. But you have to look at the positives, and by the same token, both my mum and my wife's mother, they got the experience of becoming grandmothers and to be a part of our kids' formative years, which is, that's definitely something that's worth being happy about and remembering. So yeah, a little bit of sadness, but we had a good weekend as well. Mother's Day has become a bit like Valentine's Day that we've talked about before, or Father's Day, or a lot of these other events. They've become real hallmark days, haven't they? Where the cards and the flowers and the presents come out. So do either of you have any particular bugbears about Mother's Day?
Well, I think just generally what you're talking about, I think the commercialism that kind of creeps into all of it. Whether it's Easter or Mother's Day or Halloween's the most overt one, I think, because it just wasn't really that much of a thing growing up, and now it's become this mass festival. You can just see like the shelves like switch, like when Halloween goes and then Christmas comes in, and then Mother's Day and Easter are kind of vying for shelf space. And just with like Easter, there's all sorts of nonsense you can buy for Easter now, just like bits of like plates and cups and just stuff with chicks on it and things. Like you're saying, it's I don't know, the hallmarkification of all these things that's generally a bugbear. I clearly have no issue with celebrating mothers, and it's up to the mothers and the children to how they want to represent that. But what was it? The local supermarket had like Mother's Day meals and things, which is just such a weird concept. Is it like, what does that mean? Are you giving mum a day off cooking, or is it you can't be bothered to cook much, so here's a ready meal? Or it's just any excuse to kind of slap a label on something and make it seem relevant is immensely off-putting.
As you were saying, Simon, I think with all these events, that I always have the standard complaint about, the way a bunch of flowers that cost 10 or 12 quid the week before suddenly cost £20, and then there's the way all our social media timelines get overloaded with all these best mum ever updates and so on for 24 hours, which I don't have a problem with on an individual basis, and it's in the scheme of some of the stuff we've been talking about already, it's a pretty trivial thing to be worried about. And I don't mean my comment as in any way as a criticism of any person who does post a well-intentioned message. It's just that the cumulative effect of it all tends to drive me off social media for the day. But hey, that's just me.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise, isn't there, that sometimes you just want to step away from.
Let's close this discussion by reflecting on how becoming parents has changed our experiences of Mother's Day. So, since becoming parents ourselves, do we find that we do anything different with our own mothers, or do we see the day in a different light at all? Simon?
The thing that I've taken from it is, now I'm a parent, is that my child doesn't owe me anything. I don't expect her to do anything for me. And it's up to her, like obviously down the line. She's only 5 and very excited by these things, but it's not something I expect, and I wouldn't put any guilt trips on to expect something. Let's put it that way.
How about you, John?
For me, I think I'm just forever thankful of how tolerant my mum must have been. Certainly to have me and my sister, who's only 13 months between us, and my dad was the one that was very vocal with us if we were doing wrong. But my mum was always a very calm, mannered person to be around as a child, and you knew if you'd done wrong that she was cross with you, but she didn't never held a grudge, and I'm just thankful for that, really, that I took that. That's what I take away from her, and in some little way try to show my appreciation. Like Simon said, she never expects a thing from me. No, there's no, that's a lie, actually. If I don't get her a card, I'm in big trouble, whether that's birthday, Christmas, Mother's Day. I have to get a card. But if that was all she got, she'd be happy.
I think the whole thing about it being, you're making it feel that if your kids do something or express something for you, that it's something that you feel has been earned rather than something that's just kind of a token, like just, buying a bog standard box of chocolates or something like that. I mean, I certainly find that, it becomes, I think it's much less about the presents now, and it's much more about the people. So it's appreciating all the things that our parents did for us when we were growing up, and that's the sort of thing you never really appreciate until you become a parent yourself. And then it's the kids getting all enthusiastic and the efforts they put into making their own cards, and that's kind of really fun to see, because you kind of see that they you're not having to push them into things. They just, at some level, they understand that it's about showing some appreciation. And as I say, if only they could do it all 365 days a year, that would be great.
In our house, the complete carnage that was this morning. So the day after Mother Day, 2 very stroppy daughters. It was back to earth with a bump for Mel, unfortunately. And we just both looked at each other and just rolled our eyes. So not a good house to be in this morning.
Yeah, no, I know that feeling. So anyway, that's another Mother's Day successfully negotiated for another year. So what about Father's Day then? So before we go, what have we been up to recently, other than Mother's Day, of course? John?
Today, I since finishing work today, I have been playing with a new gadget that I was sent that will be appearing on the blog soon. So a new lens system for my mobile phone, which looks quite nice.
No, look forward to that. How about you, Simon?
One thing I've been doing is upping my game on the playdate scale with my daughter. So I kind of noticed there's a lot of mums have a network, or like informally have coffee meetups and stuff, and then they turn to play dates for the kids, and I'm less of a part of that kind of mother huddle. I wrote a blog actually for a US site recently about it, and I don't I'm not talking about being ostracized. It's fine, that's not, I get on with everyone, but it's more like I'm not making these plays, so I'm just making a big effort to arrange play dates for my daughter, and it's so I've just had a run of 2 or 3 weeks of kids coming around, and it's been really fascinating just how different children act, and lots of commonality, and invariably they don't eat the food I cook for them, for instance, but it's the social capital they get from these things is kind of immeasurable.
So what have I been up to? I guess I've been making a bit of an effort the last few weeks to setting aside some one-to-one time at weekends for the kids, and for the boys in particular, who often get overlooked. It's not that we've done anything particularly special. So, with Toby, him and I went shopping for Mother's Day related stuff, and with Isaac, he was quite happy to just accompany me around Majestic as I restocked our wine rack, which was great for me. But it's just having that individual time to chat and to do what they want to do without having to compromise or to worry about one of their siblings butting in. In all honesty, it's not something we do enough of. It definitely takes a bit of effort and planning to make happen, especially if you've got 3 or more kids. But it's totally worth it for both for them and for me as well. And that's it for another episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the 3 of us online. John?
I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at DadYouGeek.
And Simon?
I am Man vs Pink, Man vs Pink, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and manversuspink.com.
Okay, and you'll find me on social media at ThatchamDad, and also on slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. So you can download this podcast on iTunes and Android devices, on our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and via a variety of podcasting apps. If you don't already, do please give us a follow on Twitter at Parents Podcast, and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. Anyway, thanks for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.